Good morning, and welcome to How to Write Science Fiction That Doesn't Suck. I hope you guys are doing okay. It's a overcast morning here in Wyoming, 31 degrees out. A couple of days ago, we got our first snow flurries. That's pretty cool. I mean, it's pretty cold actually, but the one thing I didn't like about living where I used to live was there was no seasons, so I'm kind of happy about the change in seasons. My dog is not as happy. He's a warm-blooded southeastern dog, and it gets cold, and he doesn't want to hang out outside as much anymore. But he'll get used to it. He'll get his blood thickened up, as my mom used to say. Okay, today I want to veer a little bit from my usual subject focus on just craft, and I want to talk about something that involves more the business of writing. Yeah, I think it's still part and parcel of what I like to talk about here because it's not trying to tell you how to be successful. It's trying to tell you how to evaluate the parameters for your success. So today I want to talk about honesty. It's such a lonely word. Everyone is so untrue. Sorry, a little Billy Joel moment there, but being honest with yourself. It's the hardest form of honesty. Um, being brutally self aware and evaluating yourself and your talent in a really honest and objective manner. Now, it's hard to be objective about literature, even when it's not your own literature, because we all like what we like. And sometimes we like authors because of what they write, the style they write in, or the subject matter, more than we do their own talent. But I think that having a clear and honest self evaluation can be very helpful to you in determining the path that you want to take for your career. So I'll start out by doing it on me, just to show you that it is possible and it's not soul destroying. I am an average writer. Sometimes I venture into a good writer. And you say, wow, you got a career, you make a living at this. How can... Yes, but you have to understand, you have to be honest, not just in self evaluation, but in the tiers of talent that you evaluate in others. Because you've got to understand there's people like out there like Ernest Hemingway, uh, Dostoevsky. Let's just stick to science fiction since that's what I write. Robert Heinlein, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Frank Herbert. These are on a scale, I use a scale of 1 to 5, and those people are the fives. If you're talking horror, it'd be Stephen King, although I don't like his stuff, but I mean, just objectively, he's a good writer. Fantasy, it would be, I'm not as big of a fantasy reader. But it would, I think Patrick Rothfuss is considered one of the best. I don't read that kind of fantasy, so I can't say for sure. But like George R. R. Martin, they're the fives. They're the people at the top of the mountain, that everybody considers a great writer. Let's just say in our rating system, they're examples of fives. Well, if those people are the fives, and you get to the fours, you have great writers who make lots of money. So if Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, and in my opinion, Walter John Williams are fives, when you get to the fours, you still have people like John Ringo, David Weber, Larry Correia, Timothy Zahn, William Gibson. These are all incredible writers who make lots of money and sell millions of books. And yet they can't be the five because the five is the top of the mountain. It's the point of the pyramid. And there's only a few fives who ever lived. And if you cheapen the five by making everybody you like a five, then the system has no meaning. And you can't be objective about your own writing if you can't be objective about the writing of the science fiction writers that you admire and enjoy. So if the fives are up there at Robert Heinlein, and the fours are right here with David Weber and John Ringo, and then you get to the threes. The threes are the majority of people who make a living writing. Not the ones who sell millions of books, not the ones who, have TV shows made from them, not the ones who are the keynote speakers at conferences. The threes are just your average Joe who makes a living at writing. I'm a three. I'm the average Joe. I am not at the level of the fours. I don't know if I'll ever be. I think being objective and trying to look at things from the outside, I think at my best points in my career, the best writing I've done, I might get to the edge of four. But my whole career basically is built on being three. And this is where things are going to get a little bit controversial. But there's buttloads of people out there who make a good living or make a lot of extra money at two. And there's also a bunch that are at one that they don't make any money or much money. They don't have a career. This is just a side hustle for them. Now, let me make something else clear. When I'm scaling from 1 to 5, from bad to average, from bad to average to good to very good to the best, that is not the total population of the earth or everybody that's ever lived. This is people who try to write for publication. It's not everybody who writes a diary or everybody who scribbles down, a short story when they're a kid. This is everybody who writes with the intent to publish. I mean, if I was including everybody in the world, then 90% of the people who ever live would be one. Maybe 99% of them. So when we're talking people who write for publication, the ones are all those millions of books you see on Amazon that never make any money and never make it out of the hundreds of ranks in the hundreds of thousands or millions. That's the ones. The twos are the ones who sometimes make a good living, but they have to heavily market and heavily write to trope. The threes are the ones who are considered professionals in their field and who are respected for not just their marketing ability, but their writing ability. And the fours are the ones who are the current, masters, I guess you would call it, in their field. And the fives are the all-time greats. So when I say that everybody listening to this YouTube channel is most likely, in all honesty, a two at the best, it's not an insult. It took me a long time writing to get to a three. I've been writing since I was a child. I finished my first 2 books when I was in high school. If it takes 10,000 hours of something to get good, if it takes 1 million words writing to get good, I did that writing before I graduated college. So it's not something where you were born that way. I mean, there is some inherent talent involved in it, but it's also just pure experience. And if you're just starting now, if you can be a two, that's an accomplishment. Because as I said, 90% of people who try to write for publication are ones. So you're getting up into a narrow, like, and the twos are probably another 8%. And then you get the fours, the threes are maybe 2%, and then down to the fours are a fraction of a percent. And the fives are a fraction of a percent that ever lived. So look honestly at yourself. And when I say that you need to honestly and objectively rate your writing, I don't want you to rate it against your friends. I don't want you to hand your book to your sister or your cousin and say, read this and tell me how good I am. I mean, you need to read the masters. You need to read, in our genre that we're talking about here, science fiction, go read Heinlein, go read Clarke, go read Asimov, go read Frank Herbert, then read, David Weber and John Scalzi if you like. I don't like him. I don't like his work that much, but it's very popular, and I'm sure he's a really good writer. Read Walter John Williams. Read William Gibson. Read all the people who put science fiction on the map and the people who were masters at it at that point. And then look at your own work. And don't look at it from the eyes of, I wrote this, it's my baby. Look at it from the eyes of, if they read it, what would they think of it? If I handed somebody, Armor by John Steakley or Forever War by Joe Haldeman, and then my military science fiction novel, and I had them read all three, which two do you think they would consider the best? Yeah, that's the humbling part. That's the hard part. And the part that realizes you're not that great, and neither am I. It's why I don't title this video series "How to Write Great Science Fiction," or even "How to Write Really Good Science Fiction." It's how to write science fiction doesn't suck. You don't want to be down in the ones. That's your goal. The goal of you watching these videos, of you practicing every day, of you writing every day, of you reading the source material and keeping up the words on the keyboard. I mean, you may think the goal is to be 5, and it's great to have a long-term goal, but the odds are that 5 is out of reach, because that's the top of the mountain. If everybody could be Albert Einstein, then there would be being Albert Einstein wouldn't be a big deal for physicists. There's only a few of those. Those are your heroes, the gods. Your goal should be to be in the 4s, but that also is not, honestly, it's not realistic for most writers. The realistic goal for most writers should be to get into the 3s, the reliably good, very readable authors who make enough money to make a living on. And that is doable. And I'll tell you another secret, and this is also something that you don't say to people's faces, obviously, and you don't name names, but a huge amount of the people who make at least a passable living at writing in self-published and indie fiction are 2s, talent-wise. And that should not be an indictment of self-publishing. That should be encouragement to you that even if you are a 2 and haven't yet made your way to 3, you can still make a living at this. Now that's where I get in. I was telling you at the beginning that you need to use this self-assessment to determine the path of your career. Because it used to be the way things worked. You wrote short stories, and you kept writing one short story after another, sometimes thousands of them, until you got a few that were good enough that they were published in the science fiction magazines, Analog magazine, science fiction and fantasy. There's a whole bunch of them that used to be out. I don't know if they exist anymore. Most people have never heard of them now. I mean, people younger than me, in their 30s and 40s. But things are different now. Those magazines don't really exist as a filtering body anymore, because you would get published in those your short stories would get published in those magazines, and then after a while you would write novels. I mean, you probably were writing them already, but you'd keep polishing them, and when you got one or two that you thought were good enough to get published, you would package those up. You would put the list of all those short stories you had published in your cover letter, and you would send those off to a publisher or to agents. A lot of people, a lot of publishers required agents, and you would send the ones off to the publishers that didn't require agents. You'd send those out to them directly, and then you'd try to get an agent. And the odds are you'd never get an agent. And the one people who did get agents, not everybody got published. I had an agent. I did not get published back then. And then if you were bloody-minded and stubborn enough to just keep at it anyway, you would write more books, or you would polish those books and you'd send them out again. This would take years. Not a year, not a couple of years, years, like 6, 7 years sometimes, to get a book published. That's not the way things work anymore. I mean, of course, you can still send books out to publishers and try to get them published that way. And it's harder than ever, not because there are fewer books put out now, but because there's so many more people submitting. But now you have other options. There are small publishers who are mostly concentrating on individual genres or a cluster of genres, like Aethon Books, my main publisher. They publish science fiction, a lot of military science fiction, mostly military science fiction. They publish lit RPG and progression fantasy, and not much else. And they've branched into different other subgenres, but they have their niche, and that's what they publish, and they make a good living at that for themselves and their authors, because they have restricted themselves to that niche. There's others out there. I can't think of the names of all of them off the top of my head, but there are independent publishers who will take submissions. There are others who only go to authors that are established as self-published authors and ask them to write in their stable of authors. So you have that option. That is a attractive option for a lot of people, because these people, like, say, Chris Kennedy Publishing or Aethon, they handle. There's another one that specializes in fantasy. I can't think of the name of it. I'm sorry. I'm not a fantasy author yet, and I don't keep track of that sort of thing. But there are other small publishers who specialize in indie publishing on Amazon, audiobooks, things like that. And that is an option because they will cover the cost of your editing, your cover art, the formatting, and you just write, and you send them the story. They send you back the edits. You fix what's wrong, and it's just like a traditional publisher. The only difference is, the main difference is, most of the time your books are not going to be in B. Dalton, or is B. Dalton still? Never mind. Barnes and Noble or Books A Million, or any of the big bookstores, because they have deals with certain distributors. So you're going to be mostly selling your books on Amazon. sometimes selling them wide via other distributors, but you're mostly looking at ebooks. And there's a big upside to that. There's the reason these small publishers exist is because ebooks are so cheap to publish. Um, I mean, you do have all these places have print on demand books, but that's not the majority of what you're going to be selling. You're going to be selling that and audiobooks. And that's why these small publishers can make a living, is because this is a very narrow audience and you can focus on it. That's also a downside for you, though, is that the audience is narrow. There's only so many people, for instance, who read military science fiction ebooks. I mean, it's a good number of people. It's enough to make a living off of. But you're not going to get rich, most likely. A lot of the readers still read hardcover or paperback books. They still get them from the physical bookstore, brick and mortar. So your audience is narrow, but on the plus side, you get to keep more of the royalties. You get more of a say in things. So that's the difference in traditional publishing and in the indie publishing, or also self-publishing. Self-publishing is more difficult. Self-publishing is you're not just a writer anymore. You are a publishing company. Now, you may be a really slapdash publishing company. You may be farming everything out to contractors, which can be really expensive, but you wind up paying for it. And if you don't make money off your book, then you're in the hole. And this is why I don't get into the marketing section of publishing, because it's something that you have to have as a job. Your job is not just being a writer anymore when you're self-publishing. Your job is being a writer and a marketer and an editor and a cover art person. And I mean, you hire out to contractors for that stuff, but in the end, you have to make the final decision. So you can get somebody to make a cover for you, but you're the one that has to judge, is this cover going to sell my book? So you have to know about that stuff. You can send your book to an editor, but when you get those edits back, are you going to say, I don't know if this editor is right for me. I don't know if they're doing the right thing. You have to be the final arbiter. And it's difficult. It's not just being a writer anymore. It's being a publisher. It's why I don't self-publish anymore. Because it takes a whole half of your day, which means a whole half of your week, which means a whole half of your life doing this crap that I don't like and don't want to do. So if you can get somebody else to do that work for you, then you are, that's half the battle right there. So you have all these options now. But you have to be honest about where you fit in. If you're a 2, you may have to prove yourself and gain experience to get to be a 3. And a lot of people like Athon, these other publishers, they don't deal with 2s. Or if you're a 2, you don't get the money that the other people do. You don't get audio advances and things like that for your audiobooks. They only give that to people they know that are going to sell books. So if you're a 2, you may want to self-publish your books first until you prove yourself and grow as an author. And also, if you're a 2, it is very, very possible to make a good living as an author. But, and this is a big but, as I was saying, you can't be thinking just as an author. You can't be thinking, when you start down to write your book, you can't just be thinking of what story do I want to tell. You have to be thinking, what story sells? So, see, here's another tangent, but Trad Publishing has chosen, in its infinite wisdom over these last, I would say 20 years or so, to veer away from more traditional uh, tropes, you might say. For instance, in fantasy, I can't count how many times I have heard and read editors and writers and people involved in traditional publishing say, yeah, we aren't looking for your Tolkien medieval European fantasy with dragons and orcs and elves. That's old hat. We want something new and different. You know, can you come up with like I don't know, Aztec fantasy or Asian fantasy or whatever, something different than the usual, and that's fine. And there's a lot of good books written like that. But what traditional publishing ignores is there's still a huge market for traditional medieval European fantasy with dragons and elves and orcs, dragons and elves and orcs, and you can make a living writing that, but you can't sell those books to, you know, the mainstream publishers because they are not interested anymore. I mean, you can if you're Patrick Rothfuss or George R. R. Martin, but for the guy trying to break in or woman trying to break into publishing, trying to break into the business, that's not the book they're going to buy. That's the only thing that catch the eye of the editor. So if you are a 2 in the author hierarchy and your writing ability is not where you want it to be eventually, but you want to make a living, you write those books that people want to read that nobody else is writing. And you market them in such a way as to get those people's attention. Dropshipper, Contact Front, first book in it. Do I think it's a good book? Yeah, I think it's a really good book. But it's also, besides being a good book, it is directed squarely at a market that is underserved. Because the traditional publishers, when they do military science fiction, they want something different. There has to be something different about it. I just wrote a Space Marine book with powered armor. I made the characters compelling as I could. I tried to make the situation imaginative, and detailed. But when it comes down to it, it's Space Marines and powered armor. And people want to read Space Marines and powered armor. You don't need to give it a twist. You don't need to give it a protagonist that's also a werewolf shifter or a protagonist that has split personalities. You can do all that stuff, but that stuff isn't necessary because people just really want to read a good Space Marine in battle armor story. So if you were at a 2 on the author hierarchy and you want to make a living at this, you can. But you have to write to the tropes that people want to read. And that can change with time. I mean, there's in urban fantasy, there was like things with academy stories where people in like sorcerer academies right after Harry Potter, and people wrote series in there and made lots of money off of them. But you have to be fast. You have to have an ear to the ground to sense the trends that are upcoming, and you need to be able to get those books out there quickly, which means you have to be a publisher. So if you're looking to make a living at writing at level 2 talent, you have to be a publisher as well as an author. And that's not impossible, but there's just a few people that can do it. Now I'll say there are more people at 2 who can make a living marketing their work, even if it's not top notch, than there are people that are at 4 who can make a really good living not having to market their work because it is top notch. So if you are at 2 and you're honest with yourself, then maybe you need to look into what it takes to market your work. If you can't get a small publisher to put your stuff out, then your own small publisher. It's not impossible. I'm not recommending it to everybody because it's really hard, but it's a way to make a living while you hone your craft. And believe me, you can go from a 2 to a 3. You can You can go from a 1 to a 3. You just have to keep writing. Um, so when I tell you to be honest with yourself, I am not telling you to discourage yourself, because for one thing, like I said, you can grow as an author. You may never get to 4, but you could. Some people do. You'll never get to 5, and I hope I'm not spitting on your dreams by telling you that almost nobody if I had a million watchers for this video, one of them maybe could get to 5. So don't feel like you're a failure because you're never going to be, Robert Heinlein. Almost nobody is. Don't feel like you're a failure if you don't get to be David Weber or John Ringo. I mean, those guys have they have a huge audience, and they're, considered the masters in their field for a reason, because there's very few people that can write like them. Your goal should be to get to 3 and maybe scrape the bottom of 4. And that 4 is the thing. If you really hustle, if you really give it everything you have, you get to 4. But there's lots of people making good livings at 3. So don't feel like if you're a 2 or a 3 that your career's over. I'm a 3. I have no illusions about that. Maybe some of my stuff, I have 60 books or something. Maybe some of it gets to the lower level of 4, maybe a mid-level even. But that's a few books out of a lot. But I keep writing because I feel like I'll get better at it. And also, the more you write, the more people buy, the more they read, the better my chances of making a living at this are. And I'm doing pretty good right now. It's taking lots of work. If you don't want to put in that kind of work to writing, then you might consider just relegating writing to a hobby, because it takes lots of work. Now, this video has been, like I said, a departure from my usual. I'm talking a lot of the business end of things here instead of the craft. But it's a reaction kind of to listening for years to people who have a distorted idea, not just of their own talent, but of the talent of others, and more importantly, on the importance of that talent, on the importance of honesty to yourself. I hear people all the time say, don't criticize your own writing, don't be hard on yourself. Be hard on yourself. Be honest with yourself. Know what progress you have to make, and know what you can do with your writing to make a living until you make that progress. Because you don't have to be a great writer to make a living at writing. You just have to work really hard. It's like anything else. You don't have to be great at most things to make a good living at it. You just have to work hard. All right, I'm going to let you go. I think I've rambled on enough. This is Rick Partlow, and I will talk to you next time.